Prologue: The Cold Return. The heavy, iron-reinforced oak doors of the great hall creaked open, throwing a broad, slate-gray beam of winter light across the frost-hewn stone. Knight, Queen Skade, and the senior Vanyard stepped across the threshold, their heavy boots crunching rhythmically over the stray rushes. They spoke in low, gravelly tones, their deep voices rich with an unexpected burning warmth. For the first time in months, the suffocating shroud of existential dread had lifted from the shoulders of the northern elite. They had a plan. They had a true dual-tailed alpha walking at their flank. They had a fighting chance. But the words died in their throats. The hopeful air froze solid in a single, collective heartbeat. Sitting carelessly on Skade's massive, fur-lined throne at the far end of the hall was a man who shouldn't have existed in this hemisphere. It was Thorn. He did not look like a warlord bred from the jagged ice of the north. He looked like a pristine piece of high society lumina dropped directly into a slaughterhouse. He wore a tailored, seamless white suit without a single speck of mountain dirt or old blood to mar its fabric, a blinding, clean silhouette against the grim, shadow-cast timbers of the hall. A sharp white fedora was tilted slightly forward, throwing a stark chevron of shadow across the upper half of his face. Resting between his knees was an elegant silver-headed cane, his gloved hands draped casually over the filigree handle. He looked entirely at ease, as if he were holding court in a high-class capital parlor rather than lounging in the raw, beating heart of an enemy fortress. The sudden, impossible presence of the Reaper turned the hall into a pressure cooker. The elders and Vanyards instantly locked, their bodies turning to stone as their fingers dropped instinctively to the wrapped hilts of their blades. This changed everything. They were supposed to be the hunters tracking him to the depths of the Old Fang Cave. Instead, the apex predator was already waiting in their home, warming himself by their hearth. Thorn slowly raised his chin, a thin, razor-sharp smile cutting across the darkness beneath his brim. "Well, well," Thorn murmured. His voice was smooth, carrying a terrifying, rhythmic cadence that echoed flawlessly through the high rafters. "I came to collect my prize." Skade's breath hitched. Involuntary ancestral instinct warred violently against her newly forged resolve. For a devastating split second, her chin dipped in a flash of deep, conditioned shame. Thorn's smile widened, though his eyes remained entirely dead as his gaze drifted past her, landing squarely on the scarred outlander. "But I see a structural problem. Why is his head still attached to his shoulders, Queen Skade?" He shifted slightly, lifting his arm and tapping the silver head of his cane against the stone floor. Tap, tap. The sound echoed like a death knell through the silent hall. "You didn't suddenly grow a conscience, did you? Because you know very well what happens to your precious little bloodline if you fail to deliver." The temperature in the room plummeted toward absolute zero. The Vanyards shifted uncomfortably, the horrific memory of Thorn's soul-reaping purple-black magic looming heavy over their pride, threatening to turn them into hollow husks. Knight didn't flinch. He stepped out in front of Skade, crossing his arms over his bare, battle-scarred chest, directly breaking Thorn's line of sight. He stared at the man in the white suit, his golden eyes narrowing, entirely unimpressed by the theatricality of the trap. "Thorn, I presume," Knight said, his baritone voice steady and resonant, carving through the Reaper's suffocating aura. A low, mocking chuckle rumbled in his chest as his eyes caught the pristine linen. "The all-white look is a bit much, don't you think? Kinda hard to blend into the shadows when you dress like a winter ballroom decoration." Thorn's smile didn't fade, but the air around the throne grew perceptibly heavier, a localized, crushing pressure beginning to bleed outward from his form. He didn't even acknowledge the Outlander's mockery. Instead, he simply tightened his gloved grip on his cane and addressed the entire room of wolves. "I tell you what," Thorn said, his voice dropping into a cold, venomous register that vibrated with absolute authority. "The next person in this room to bring me his head will earn their right to breathe another day. Fail me now, and the extinction of the iron pelt starts before the sun sets." The words hung in the air like a final decree. Instantly, the atmosphere in the great hall fractured. The Vanyards and elders looked at each other, their pupils dilated with sudden agonizing panic. They looked at Knight, the man who had just shown them a new path, the man they had sworn to march with into the dark. Then their eyes flicked back to Thorn, the monstrous entity who held the lives of their pups, their mates, and their entire history in his bleeding hands. The silence that followed was suffocating. Hands trembled against weapon hilts. Shifting bones popped quietly in the shadows as the primal instinct for survival clashed violently with their newfound camaraderie. The line between allies and executioners blurred in a heartbeat, and every single soul in the room stood on the edge of a knife, waiting to see who would draw first blood. Chapter 1. The Shadow of the Crown. 3 months earlier. To understand how a ghost from the lowlands ended up at the mercy of a northern executioner, one must return to the blood-slicked cobblestones where the hunt first began. The air within the high stone gates of Lumina had turned brittle, carrying the distinct metallic tang of an approaching frost. As night navigated the labyrinth of the lower districts, the capital felt physically altered, as though the very stones had absorbed the cruel, calculating malice of its newly crowned sovereign. A heavy, suffocating gray mist, thick with the smog of the city's coal-fired underbelly, clung to the uneven cobblestones, and the sky above was perpetually choked by a low-hanging canopy of dark clouds that refused to break. King Aurelius's ascendance hadn't merely rewritten the laws of the realm, it had altered the ether itself, transforming a once vibrant metropolis into a quiet graveyard of ambition. The bustling nocturnal commerce Knight had encountered upon his first arrival weeks ago was utterly extinguished. The lively chatter of merchants, the clinking of tankards from tavern doorways, and the distant hum of the civilian populace had been replaced by a grim metronomic cadence, the rhythmic, iron-shod thud of armored guards patrolling the city's perimeter. Every storefront window was heavily shuttered, and every oak door was double-bolted well before the sun dipped below the horizon, as if the darkness itself had become a state-sanctioned predator. He felt the prickling weight of surveillance with every stride. Every distorted shadow thrown against the brickwork felt like a pair of watching eyes. Every sudden rustle of the wind through the eaves sounded like a pointing finger. He paused in the deep recess of a crumbling alleyway, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Plastered against the damp masonry was a fresh parchment, the black ink still tacky and smelling of cheap vinegar. His own face stared back at him from the paper, a crudely sketched wanted poster bearing a bounty high enough to turn a saint into a desperate sinner. The distance to the southern border, once a journey of mere days across open plains, now loomed in his mind as a perilous trek across an infinite hostile continent. "It will get far worse," the echo of Voss's voice reverberated within his skull, a jagged, unwelcome reminder of the veteran rogue's warning that Knight had so blindly ignored in his pursuit of vengeance. A cold knot tightened in Knight's chest as his gaze swept across the urban desolation. Was he the architect of this misery? Was he responsible for the shivering children hiding behind locked doors, or the blood that would inevitably lacquer these streets under Aurelius's iron boot? He shook his head violently, his teeth baring instinctively in the shadows. No, the Vale family had earned their ruin. They were the monstrous lineage that had orchestrated the eradication of his own pack, hunting his kin like beasts and laughing as the ancestral fires consumed his heritage. Their blood was the absolute, non-negotiable currency of justice. If the capital suffered because a more calculating monster had stepped into the vacuum of power left by the slain aristocrats, he told himself it was not his burden to bear. It was a clean trade. Yet as he stared down the empty, silent thoroughfares, the justification tasted of cold ash. Seeking a moment of geographical and mental clarity, Knight scaled the jagged, rocky ridge that guarded the city's western limits. From this elevated vantage point, he could look down upon the sprawling, walled estate of House Vile. For 10 long years that estate had been the North Star of his hatred, a fortress of demons he had sworn to level to the bedrock. Yet his sharp eyes softened as memory betrayed him. He recalled standing in this exact spot weeks prior, when the grand house had seemed to pulse with a hidden, inviting warmth. Because Seraphine Vale had been within those walls, the estate hadn't looked like a military target. It had looked like a sanctuary. She was the unexpected light that had fractured his monochrome world of bloodlust, turning his pursuit of ruin into something vibrant, something worth protecting. Now that light was thoroughly snuffed out. The Vale estate was a black hollow, cold, silent, and skeletal. With Aurelius now occupying those ancestral halls, the very architecture seemed to have shifted, turning sharp and predatory. The realization finally fractured Knight's denial. His selfish, single-minded need for blood had transformed Seraphine's home into a tomb. He wondered, with a sickening pang of guilt, how many more would have to perish because he lacked the strength to let go of the ghosts of his past. He turned his gaze further westward toward the isolated grove where the shallow earth held the remains of his parents. The urge to visit them, to press his forehead against the damp soil and beg for some sign of absolution, was a physical ache that locked his limbs. But he remained rooted to the rock. He knew the tactical mind of the new king too well. Aurelius's hounds would not leave such an obvious emotional vulnerability unguarded. They would be crouched in the tall grass with heavy crossbows leveled, waiting for the grieving son to make his final sentimental mistake. With a heavy, ragged breath, Knight turned his back on the resting place of his parents and the city he had fractured, stepping instead into the oppressive, unwelcoming dark of the road ahead. Yet logic is often the first casualty of a broken heart. Knight's feet carried him toward the western grove before his conscious mind could even register the change in his gait. The cold metrics of survival screamed at him to maintain his heading toward the southern border, but the hollow, echoing ache within his ribs drowned out his training. He could not leave Lumina. Not like this. He could not carry the crushing weight of what he had done without telling the dead that the ledger was balanced. He had to stand over that sacred soil one last time and whisper the finality of his actions. The aristocrats who had ordered their deaths were gone. The graveyard was draped in the same unnatural freezing mist that had choked the lower wards of the city. As he crossed the threshold of the iron gates into the familiar clearing, the scent reached his hypersensitive senses long before the sight did. The heavy, cloying copper tang of old blood, and the stagnant, unnatural chill that always accompanied the presence of the undead. He did not slow his pace. He did not attempt to conceal his approach. A dozen slender figures detached themselves from the long shadows of the leaning marble headstones. They were Aurelius's personal vanguard, vampires of pure blood, their crimson irises gleaming with a predatory, sadistic hunger, their pale skin translucent under the weak moonlight. They had been waiting for him, precisely as his tactical mind had predicted, but the sudden sight of them did not breed caution. Instead, the remnants of his fear were instantly incinerated by a white-hot, jagged surge of adrenaline. "Knight," one of the vanguard hissed, his lips curling back to reveal elongated, translucent fangs. "The king said you'd come to crawl at your parents' feet like a beaten cur." Knight provided no verbal reply. He simply let the growl begin deep within the marrow of his bones. The wolf inside his blood didn't merely wake, it detonated. The ensuing transformation was a violent, seamless blur of snapping cartilage, elongating bone, and tearing fabric. He shifted with an explosive speed that rendered the vampire's supernatural reflexes utterly obsolete. The first vanguard did not even possess the time to raise a defensive guard before Knight's massive, fur-clad claws raked cleanly through his throat, sending a fountain of dark, unliving ichor spraying across the pristine white marble of an adjacent tombstone. He became a whirlwind of midnight fur and primal fury, a gruesome shadow weaving through the ancient grove. He caught a second attacker by the lower jaw mid-lunge. The sickening sound of splintering bone echoed through the silent trees as he ripped the creature's skull from its spine with a single continuous twist. It ceased to be a combat engagement. It was a methodical slaughter. He moved as a localized force of nature, a vengeful deity disposing of ancestral trash. Necks snapped like dry kindling under his weight. Pale limbs were torn from their sockets with a wet, heavy crunch that offended the silence of the night. Within less than a minute, the grove descended into stillness once more, saved only by the heavy, ragged respiration of the beast and the hot steam rising from the cooling, dismembered corpses scattered carelessly among the graves. As the monstrous wolf began to recede, snapping back into human proportions, a sudden searing pain spiked violently behind his eyes. The purple hue, the volatile, toxic rot of the parasite vein had infected him with, flared with a malicious intensity. It felt like 1,000 writhing needles were stitching through his brain, a parasitic hunger that threatened to devour his very sanity and pull his consciousness down into a state of permanent feral madness. Knight collapsed heavily onto the grass, his human fingers digging deep furrows into the frozen earth as he fought to keep the internal dark from eating him alive. For several agonizing minutes, he writhed in the dirt, his vision swimming in a suffocating violet haze until finally, through sheer force of will, the pressure broke. Trembling, his skin slick with cold sweat, he forced himself up. He crawled the remaining few feet to the two modest mounds of earth he had first stood over in the pouring rain a decade ago. The sensory memory of that night, the cold, the absolute despair, the blood oath vow, rushed back into his mind with the force of a physical blow. "It's done," he whispered, his voice cracked, raw, and completely hollowed by exhaustion. He pressed his blood-stained palms flat against the damp soil of his parents' graves. "The Vial house is broken. I did exactly what I promised you I would do. They can't hurt anyone else." He closed his eyes, but the mental image of Seraphine's tear-stained face flickered briefly behind his eyelids, casting a long, dark shadow over his hard-won victory. "You can rest now," he said, his forehead lowering until it touched the cold grass between the mounds. "You've been avenged, but please, forgive me for what I had to become to achieve it." Knight stood up slowly, his knees vibrating slightly from the immense physical exertion of repelling the purple haze within his mind. He looked down at the two graves, but the words, "The vials are no more," felt like bitter, jagged shards of glass beneath his tongue. It was a profound half-truth that tasted entirely of failure. He had saved Seraphine from her family's corruption, yet by his own hand he had cleared the political chessboard for the terrifying return of her father's brother, Aurelius. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the internal conflict down into the dark. "It doesn't matter," he told himself, his jaw tightening. "The primary debt is paid." He turned his amber gaze back to the scene of carnage he had left in the center of the grove. The dozen vampires he had so brutally dismantled were not staying dead. Because he had not systematically destroyed their hearts or severed their heads from their torsos, their high-tier supernatural physiology was already beginning to knit their tissues back together. It was a grotesque, sickening display of biological resilience. Shattered jawbones clicked rhythmically as they reset their alignments, and severed muscle fibers writhed in the grass like nests of pale worms, reaching out through the dark to reattach to bone. One particularly mangled vampire was slowly dragging its upper torso toward its severed lower limbs, the sound of wet, sliding flesh filling the silence of the graveyard. Night loomed over them, his elongated shadow stretching long and monstrous across the gore-stained grass under the moonlight. He watched a severed throat close up, the pale skin stitching itself together with a frantic rhythmic pulsing. "The only redeeming quality about your kind," Night said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory hum as he stepped toward the creature attempting to realign its skull, "is that I can kill you as many times as I deem necessary." He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wet earth. "I just need to let you heal, and then I can kill you again, and again, and again." The arrogant, aristocratic defiance of the king's hounds vanished in an instant. As their cerebral tissues reformed and their minds cleared from the trauma of the initial assault, they realized the absolute horror of their tactical situation. They were entirely helpless, half-formed, and entirely at the mercy of a predator who viewed the repetition of their deaths as a clinical exercise. "Please," one of them wheezed, its newly formed vocal cords straining against the residual blood clogging its airway. "Mercy. We were only following the kings." The vanguard began to openly beg, his pale hands clawing frantically at the dirt as he tried to scramble away from the golden-eyed executioner standing over him. The others joined the chorus, a broken, terrified symphony of fractured voices, pleading for a life they had spent centuries denying others. "Fortunately for you, I am on a strict schedule," Night said, his expression turning entirely cold and clinical. He didn't execute a full shift this time. He maintained his human silhouette, but he allowed the raw, concentrated power of his pack lineage to surge exclusively into his right arm. The skin darkened instantly to a midnight hue. Thick, corded fur erupted through the shreds of his sleeve, and his hand elongated into a massive, wickedly curved wolf's paw tipped with obsidian talons. One by one, he moved through the writhing pile of monsters. He reached into their regenerating chests with the absolute precision of a surgeon and the crushing force of a landslide. Each movement was punctuated by the sharp, wet thwack of a ribcage being shattered inward, followed by the final, squelching rip of an immortal heart being torn clean from its vessel. He tossed the 12th heart into the gray mist, watching as the bodies finally went rigid, their skin rapidly graying until it took on the color and texture of ash. The task was finished. Lumina was finally behind him, a grand city of shadows, corruption, and deep regrets. And the path to the southern border was the only thing that remained on the board. He had made sure his tracks pointed clearly toward the sunlit lands of the south, a deliberate thread left for any hounds Aurelius might send to sniff out his trail. Let them hunt a ghost in the lowlands. The safety he truly sought lay in a completely different direction, but for now, the illusion had to be maintained. Chapter 2. The White Devil.